Hello, and welcome to Roots of Today, the podcast where the past meets the present. With every episode, we journey through time, uncovering the lessons, parallels, and connections between historical milestones and current events to create a deeper understanding of the compelling stories and issues that shape the news. We recently passed the 84th anniversary of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the attack that finally dragged the United States into the Second World War. When I was a kid, I remember it being something that most people observed every December 7th, much like the media still takes note each September 11th to mark the anniversary of the terrorist attacks against the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. On a personal note, it is sobering to realize that my birthday is closer to the real attack on Pearl Harbor than today is to the 9/11 attacks, and with that comes the realization that much is forgotten, and only the event itself, without much context about it, is what is remembered. When we look back on World War II in the Pacific, we tend to remember it in shorthand. Pearl Harbor, then, almost immediately, Midway. Sometimes we pause at the Doolittle Raid, a brief but powerful moment of American pride and resolve, before moving forward into the long, island-hopping campaign that ultimately ends the war. It's a clean story, a satisfying one. But for the Americans who were already in the Pacific, when the attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war, history did not move that quickly. Midway was not the next chapter in their war. It was 7 months away and thousands of miles beyond their reach. While Americans at home marked a somber Christmas and began preparing for a global conflict against both Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, Americans in the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and other U.S. territories in the Pacific faced something far more immediate. They were fighting for survival. As always, this is Alan, your host, reminding you to grab your coffee, tea, or whatever beverage you prefer as we look back on the war before the war that we remember. Pearl Harbor is often remembered as a beginning. In reality, it was the centerpiece of a much larger offensive that was already underway. Japan did not strike Hawaii and then decide what to do next. It struck across the Pacific and Southeast Asia almost simultaneously. Within days, Guam fell. Wake Island was under siege. The Philippines were invaded. British and Dutch possessions across the region were collapsing just as quickly. American forces were scattered across vast distances, often undersupplied and underprepared, operating on assumptions shaped by an earlier era of warfare. There was no pause to regroup, no moment to fully absorb what had happened. For many American troops, the war did not begin with a call to arms, but with retreat. And yet, when we look back, this period is often skipped over, compressed, treated as an awkward prelude to the real fighting that follows. But for the people living it, this was the war. The American and Filipino forces defending the Philippines were never expected to win outright. Their mission was to delay. Every day they held out disrupted Japanese planning. Every week bought time for the United States to rebuild, reorganize, and learn how to fight a modern war. That time mattered, but it came at an enormous cost. As forces withdrew onto the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor, supplies ran out, disease spread, rations dwindled to starvation levels. By Christmas 1941, many defenders were already weakened, exhausted, and unsure whether relief would ever come. And yet, they held. In April 1942, Bataan finally fell. What followed, the Bataan Death March, was one of the most infamous atrocities of the war. Thousands of American and Filipino prisoners died from abuse, dehydration, exhaustion, and execution. For those men, the war was not about strategy or turning points, it was about endurance. For those still holding out on Corregidor, Christmas had passed not with celebration, but with dread. Wake Island offers another window into this forgotten moment. A small remote outpost defended by Marines, sailors, and civilian contractors, Wake Island became the site of one of the first American tactical successes of the war. The defenders repelled an initial Japanese landing attempt, something almost unthinkable at that stage. But victory did not bring relief. No reinforcements arrived. No rescue followed. On December 23, 1941, just 2 days before Christmas, Wake Island fell. Guam had already fallen earlier that month. These were American territories, American soil, and yet, the men stationed there were effectively cut off from the nation they served. Heroism without rescue is a different kind of courage. For many, Christmas was simply another day of captivity, or another day waiting to see what came next. When we look back on these moments with our 21st century eyes, all of this raises another question. When the situation was deteriorating so rapidly, did Americans at home immediately grasp just how dire things had become? The answer is complicated. Unlike today, where the flow of information is almost impossible to control, Americans were fed an approved narrative when the war began. Why? The answer isn't quite as simple as propaganda, and it isn't quite as simple as censorship either. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, the United States adopted a two-pronged approach to information control, one military, one psychological. The first goal was practical and immediate: deny the enemy useful information. Newspapers were strongly encouraged, at first voluntarily, later more formally, to avoid reporting details that could reveal troop movements, defensive weaknesses, supply shortages, or the scale of losses. Information itself was understood as a weapon. The second goal was different, but it aligned neatly with the first: reassure the home front. The United States was about to mobilize on a scale it had never attempted before. That required public confidence, industrial cooperation, enlistment, and patience. Panic or despair would have been disastrous. As a result, early reporting from places like Bataan, Corregidor, Wake Island, and Guam tended to emphasize bravery, resistance, and Japanese losses. Hardship was sometimes acknowledged, but usually in vague terms. The full reality, starvation, disease, collapse, rarely made it into print until defeat made silence impossible. What's important here is this: these two goals were not identical, but they reinforced each other. By withholding operational details, newspapers protected military security. By emphasizing courage and resilience, they sustained morale. Neither aim required inventing victories. They simply required shaping which truths were visible and which were postponed. For Americans reading the paper at breakfast in December 1941 or January 1942, the story was one of grim determination, not desperation. Nowhere was the gap between perception and reality wider than in the Philippines. Today, it's tempting to imagine 1942 as a straight line from Pearl Harbor to Midway. It wasn't. The first half of 1942 was a brutal education. The United States lost territory, lost ships, lost thousands of lives, but it also learned. The Doolittle raid in April 1942, while militarily limited, shattered the myth of Japanese invulnerability and forced Japan to reconsider its defensive perimeter. It also provided a much-needed morale boost in the United States. The Battle of the Coral Sea halted Japanese expansion toward Australia, and in June 1942, the Battle of Midway changed the balance of naval power in the Pacific. But for those already suffering, Midway was not a turning point. It was a rumor, if it was anything at all. History telescopes events. People live through waiting. By Christmas 1942, the war had changed. American forces were fighting offensively on Guadalcanal. Momentum was replacing desperation. Christmas that year was still grim, but no longer hopeless. For many troops, it marked the first time survival felt like it might lead somewhere. Hope, at last, had evidence. When we tell the story of World War II in the Pacific as Pearl Harbor, followed quickly by Midway, we miss something essential. We miss the waiting, we miss the isolation, we miss the suffering that occurred before momentum turned, and we miss the people for whom Christmas came not as a promise, but as a test. The Second World War was also the end of an era and the start of the evolution of the press in wartime. The cooperative relationship between the American press and the military that defined World War II was shaped by trust, consensus, and belief in the war's purpose. That relationship would not last. By Vietnam, just 2 decades later, journalists no longer saw themselves as guardians of morale, and the military no longer understood why the old rules no longer applied. The shock ran both ways. World War II was not the permanent model. It was a moment. History often comforts us by compressing time. It turns long months of fear into short chapters and replaces uncertainty with inevitability. But the people who lived through history never experienced it that way. They endured without guarantees. They waited without knowing how the story would end. The forgotten Christmases of the Pacific War remind us that courage often exists without witnesses and that survival itself can be an act of resistance. As for those suddenly facing the onslaught of Japanese aggression immediately after Pearl Harbor, uncertainty did not weaken them. It revealed them. They should never be forgotten. That concludes this episode of Roots of Today. If you found this episode meaningful, please like and subscribe, and share it with someone who cares about history beyond the headline. And as always, we end each episode with this plea. Get informed, remain skeptical, and question what you hear in the mainstream media, and hold your elected representatives accountable. Your freedom depends on it.